Chapter 44. Selection had seemed to take over my every waking moment. I'd been told this would happen, and I'd never really believed it, but it was true. Something that you put so much effort and time into is hard to switch off from. The excitement of what had passed and the trepidation of what was to follow consumed me in the days off we had in between. Trucker and I would return to our student life in Bristol, where friends wandered casually between lectures and the canteen. We would tag along and hang with them, but we would also maintain a little distance. We avoided the drunken late nights and the long, lazy lines that so many of our student buddies seemed to enjoy. Instead, we were up early training or prepping kit for what was always looming ahead. Simply put, we both had a different purpose in our lives. Our next exercise was in the Black Mountains in Wales. For some reason, the dreaded midges were not out. Maybe the altitude and the wind. Whatever the reason, it came as a great relief. This now was to be our first march in pairs and not as a group, and I made sure I got coupled with Trucker by doing some nifty manoeuvring in the line-up. Each pair was set off at timed intervals, and Trucks and I got away early at 6:30 a.m. The sun was out, the morning flew by, and we made fast but hot progress across the mountains. Visibility was good, which made navigation a breeze, and we were full of confidence. We soon reached a dam and had to make a decision. We knew it was forbidden to cross a dam in the same way that it was forbidden to ever use a footpath or a forestry track unless it was part of the dreaded morning battle PT. This was a simple rule in selection to make sure that you got used to navigating properly and that the going underfoot was always hard, which inevitably it always was. In fact, I do to this day still feel a bit guilty if I go hiking on a footpath. Old habits die hard. But not crossing the dam meant that we would have to drop down and up the other side of a 400-foot ravine beneath the dam. Are we being watched by a DS or can we risk it? In the regiment's spirit of who dares wins and all that, we climbed carefully over the locked gate and ran across the 200-metre dam at a sprint. All clear. We then set about climbing up the steep face up to the next DS checkpoint some 7 miles away. 6 hours into the march, though, we were both starting to wane. The heat had been relentless, and when you were burning through 6,000 calories a day, carrying a heavy backpack, belt kit and rifle up and down steep mountains, then you need to make sure you're drinking enough, and we hadn't been. We had both been in that zone where we were moving well, feeling good, and probably got a little overly confident. That would nearly cost us our chance of passing selection. We had one last climb up a 2,000-foot ridge before dropping down to the final checkpoint, but I was already struggling. I wasn't sweating any longer, despite the heat and exertion. This was a bad sign. Each step, that steep face felt like I was carrying the world on my back. I felt dizzy, I felt delirious, and I had to keep sitting down. In short, I had heat exhaustion. I had never experienced this deliriousness and weakness before. The feeling of semi-consciousness as if in a drunken stupor, and time again I kept falling to my knees. All you want to do is to stop and lie down somewhere dark, quiet and cool, but you can't. You have to drink and then get on and get moving and hope the rehydration will take effect. Eventually I crawled over the summit and let my body rumble down the other side towards the final RV. I checked in then and collapsed in the woods with the other recruits. I had a screaming migraine headache and felt nauseous and lightheaded. I needed to start rehydrating and getting a grip of myself and fast. Meanwhile, 5 other recruits had failed to complete en route and 2 others had been picked up, all suffering from heat stroke. All were removed from the course. Part of me envied them as I saw them sprawled in a medic's truck being well looked after. It looked like a welcome relief from what I was feeling. But I knew all I had to do was hang on in there. By this time the next day, it would be another test down and another step closer to my goal. So I sat down and started to brew myself some warm, sweet tea and hoped I would soon be able to open both eyes beyond a squint. Before the night march started, we were all called on parade early. This boded badly. As we stood there, 2 recruits' names were read out and the individuals were carried forward. These 2 guys had been spotted crossing the dam earlier on in the day and were both quietly and without fuss RTU'd, or in our language, binned. Trucker and I got lucky, but we had also learned another valuable lesson. If you are going to risk it all on an act of daring, then pick your moment and don't get caught. By the time that we both set off for the night march, I was feeling a little stronger. I still had a headache, but I could stand without feeling faint, and this was progress at least. Trucker was also feeling like death, which was some consolation. Luckily, the route was relatively straightforward, and finally at 3 a.m, with a growing sense of strength and also pride that I'd come through this and was feeling stronger again, I arrived back at our base camp in the woods. I lay back and rested, awaiting the battle PT at 5:55 a.m. The battle PT started out relatively straightforward. A 3-mile pack run down a track along the valley floor. Once again, the group spread out as the DS set a blistering pace, but we soon reached the end of the track where all the trucks were waiting for us. I was feeling strong again now and was almost enjoying the fact that I was managing to keep up, whereas almost everyone else was dragging behind. At the point I reckoned the DS should turn left towards the waiting 4-tonner wagons, I saw the DS turn a hard right and head straight up the sheer 1,000-foot face to the ridgeline. It was then that the shouting really began, and this had hardly ever happened before. The DS always prided themselves on the fact that they never needed to shout. Selection was hard enough as it was. They were, as they often told us, simply run the course and observe. But suddenly there had been a tempo change and the shouting was now firm, directed and serious. Move, now! If we see any one of you walking, you are out. You get it? This hill is going to be run up. I did as I was told, turned away from the enticing trucks and headed up the steep hill, following in the DS's footsteps. I had to pace myself, I knew that. This was a big hill. With the weight of a heavy backpack, it was going to be near impossible to run up it all the way. I just had to make sure that I was not the first to be seen to be slow. I dug in and started to breathe harder and harder. Halfway up, the DS stopped and turned and watched us. I determined to keep running, however slowly, until I reached him, whatever the fatigue I felt. Finally, I reached him, somewhere in the middle of the group. My legs and shoulders felt like they were on fire, and my heart and lungs felt as if they would explode. I looked down beneath us to see the last few stragglers pulling themselves up the hill towards us. 2 guys had been reduced to only a slow shuffle. I knew they were in trouble. The DS told us the parameters. Run, you pass. Walk, you fail. Right, you lot, get back down to the track and into the 4-tonners. And you, he barked, pointing at the last 2 men. You follow me. Back at the track, as we all piled into the wagons in the muddy car park, relief swept over me. I watched out of the back of my Bedford truck as these 2 recruits who had vaulted were led off to another truck. That was the way it worked. Once someone failed, they were kept apart from the rest of us. It helped build us together into a team, and it gave those of us still hanging on in there a certain pride that we were still in the right truck. It wasn't much, but it meant a lot to us. For the next 3 weekends, the pace continued to build. The distances got longer, the weights got heavier, and the pressure mounted. Routinely, we would be covering up to 30 miles across the mountains, carrying up to 50 pounds of weight. On top of this, we were now doing every march on our own during the day and the night. The SAS were beginning to test our ability to work alone. Could we motivate ourselves to keep going, navigate effectively, and look after ourselves even when we were cold, wet, and tired? The strange thing was that I was thriving. We rarely got shouted at, and for now we were only asked to do these 3 basic tasks: navigate across the mountains, carry the weight, and be within the time. The soldiering stuff would come later on, but only to those who had first proved themselves capable of working to the max, whatever the conditions. I liked this whole ethos. Pretty soon the number of recruits in our squadron was down to under 10 men, and we'd only just completed half the mountain weekends. Trucker was still there, but many of the muscle guys had long since fallen by the wayside. It was clear that selection was taking its toll on us all physically. After each weekend, my feet and bruised body would take days to recover. I would hobble about on my tender feet and aching limbs. My body still felt relatively virgin for all this level of mountain endurance work. I was still only 20 and significantly younger than any of the other soldiers on the selection. Endurance comes with age. It was no surprise that so few young guys passed, and the optimum age was late 20s. It would be a long journey, and getting used to the strain took time. The key was that I had to learn to recover quickly. This skill would end up taking me months to develop. In the early days, my calves would be in agony after one of the long repeated fireman's lift hill sessions, and my shoulders would start to burn just after a few hours of carrying the heavy backpack around the mountains. But steadily, over the time, I hardened. Another vital lesson I learned during the first phase of selection was how to listen to and prepare my body properly. The right food, the right rest, the right training. To what level of intensity I should train in between the tests and how often. A big mistake the soldiers often make in preparing for selection was to overtrain and then get hurt with an injury. Selection becomes virtually impossible. It's an intricate balance and requires you to listen carefully to your own body. This skill has helped me so much in my life since. One thing I've always found annoying is that when I needed most sleep, I often find it hardest to achieve. It's a horrible pit of the stomach feeling, lying wide awake in bed, scared of what is ahead, knowing that your body needs rest, yet unable to switch off. My head is constantly racing, and the less sleep I get, the more it bothers my already troubled mind. And what was ahead was troubling me a lot. Our first make or break physical big test. Fail this and you are off the course. No questions asked. Infamous in SAS circles as a real tester of character, the mountain test is a grueling 18-mile speed march run in full kit, almost 3,000 feet up, and then down the other side of one particular high peak, and then all the way back to the start. 1 minute outside of the set time and you are RTU'd, no second attempts. At the foot of the mountain on a mild, clear-skied morning, I was more nervous, awaiting the set-off time for this, than I had been about anything else so far. Do I have enough food in me? Am I going to be strong today? Will I be able to maintain the pace? Within minutes of starting up the steep track, Trucker in the front group had pulled ahead of me. Come on there, push harder. You can rest all you want at the end, but you have to go for it now. Way down under the 45-pound of Bergen, belt kit, rifle, food and water, moving at that speed wasn't easy. After an hour, all of my clothes were drenched in sweat, and I was striving with all I had to push my body on, faster and faster. At the halfway mark, I took a quick gulp of water, and then I was off again, back up the long track, through the foothills, towards the distant summit. But I was behind time and I knew it. I was angry with myself. Trucker had looked in so much control as he passed me on his way back, running confidently and looking strong. In contrast, I knew that I looked as I felt, a wreck. My head was down, my eyes were down, and I was breathing wildly through spit-drenched, clenched teeth. I had to make up time and fast, or I would fail. Somehow I found my strength on the next leg, and I overtook a long line of recruits who were beginning to flag. This gave me more confidence, and I pushed harder still. At the summit, I set off almost at a sprint down to the foot of the peak and the end. I could see the DS at the gate far beneath me, tiny specks, 1,500 feet below and still 3 miles away. I gave it everything I had and ran for the finish. I made it with only 3 minutes to spare. As I sat on my pack, head hung between my legs, exhausted, the relief swept over me. I knew that almost all of those I had overtaken would be failed. Sure enough, 30 minutes later, when all the stragglers had crawled back in, a parade was called. The following names: take your kit and put it in the back of the near truck. It was clinical, cold and unapologetic. You fell yourself, remember? That day, 16 people were returned to their unit. The bar was being raised even higher, and if truth be told, I was struggling. The night march was a long one. It started at dusk and wouldn't finish until 3:30 a.m. The weather had taken a turn for the worse as it had got dark, and it was making navigation especially hard. On the way to the second-to-last checkpoint, amongst this high, windy, boggy terrain, I had to pass through a dense forest on the steep side of the mountain. On the map it looked straightforward, but in reality it was a nightmare. Thick, dense pine, piles of cut timber, and an endless thickets of gorse. After a few hundred yards, I realised that this was going to turn into a battle. I was exhausted already from 5 hours of night march through boggy moongrass, and this was the last thing I now needed. I just wanted to reach the other side of the wood. In the pitch black, navigating through this insanely dense wood, requiring pinpoint accuracy and a total dependence on your compass bearing. But the trees were unending. Finally, I broke through and hit the steep track on the far side of the forest and spotted the lone DS tent silhouetted against the skyline. The routine when arriving at a checkpoint was rigorously enforced. You approached the checkpoint, crouched down on one knee, map folded tightly in your hand and compass in the other and weapon cradled in your arms. Then you announced yourself, name, number. The DS would then give you your next 6-figure grid reference, and which you had to locate rapidly on the map, and then point out to him the corner of the compass or the blade of grass. If we were caught pointing at the map with a finger instead of a blade of grass or something sharp, we had been threatened by the unforgettable Sergeant Taff that he would rip that finger off and beat you to death with the soggy end. It's a threat that I enjoy passing to my boys when we are reading a map together nowadays. As soon as the grid reference was confirmed, it was time to pack up and off, as we were so often told. That was your cue to get moving. I moved away 20 yards from the tent and crouched down in the pitch black. I pulled out my head torch, which was covered in masking tape with just a small pinprick of light shining through, and carefully studied my laminated map. The map was always kept folded tightly in my thigh pocket, and the compass was attached to a lanyard from my jacket chest pocket. Lose either and you failed. I shuffled back around against the wind, and with a long blade of grass between my fingers, I traced out what I reckon would be the best route to take across the moorland. Make a bad choice and it could cost you precious hours. But errors can come so easily when you are wet through, sleep deprived, and struggling to see a map in the low light and strong winds. I turned into the wind and headed up the steep track alongside the wood, and then across the last 2 miles of moongrass. Come on, let's finish this one now. It was 2 a.m. I was so exhausted going along this track that I actually fell asleep walking. I'd never done that before. It was a horrible feeling having this intense desire to lie down and sleep and yet needing to fight to suppress that and just push ever onwards. An hour and a half later, I reached this small remote quarry cut out into the mountainside. As bleak a reward for finishing a night march as you can imagine. It was raining hard now and there was no tree cover to tie a poncho to. I lay down on the marshy ground, pulled my poncho across the top of me and fell asleep. I was soon shivering with the cold and utterly soaked through. I longed to just get this miserable test weekend over with. After being so cold, the Battle PT was a welcome relief. I felt I had gone into a different zone in my head now. I no longer cared about cold or wet or my aching limbs. I just wanted to get it all done. After 2 hours of running up and down this steep-sided quarry, as well as doing endless press-ups in the mud, those of us remaining were stood down. Totally beat up, totally filthy, totally drenched, and totally wired. I collapsed in the truck. The first test was complete. Our next test weekend was in a particularly hellish area of the Welsh mountains, remote, godforsaken, and full of even more boggy, ankle-twisting moongrass. The area became known affectionately by the other recruits as simply the arsehole of the world. The first march started badly for me. I just couldn't sustain the pace that I knew was required. Soon everyone was passing me. Why did I so often feel like this at the start of the march? Was it nerves? I was so frustrated with myself as I neared the first RV, and I knew I was slow. To make matters worse, twice I found myself lost in this vast quagmire of boggy wetland, only to have to use up valuable time moving off course to higher ground in order to reorientate myself. I was just having a bad day. I couldn't understand why I was tired when I should be firing and why I was flustered when I should be keeping my calm. I didn't know how to stop myself from sliding like this, and I knew that each minute I was falling further behind the required time. At the second RV, I made a navigational decision. It cost me vital time I didn't have to spare. The navigational error was selecting to contour around a mountain rather than go up and over it. It was a weak decision to try and save me energy, and it proved a disaster. If anything, choosing the longer, less steep route only served to exhaust me further. Tentative holds no power. Sometimes you just have got to tackle these mountains head on. As I arrived at the next checkpoint, the DS made me do endless press-ups in the mud, pack still on, as a punishment for approaching the last 30 yards on a track instead of along the ditch. He delayed me a full 15 minutes with this impromptu beasting, and now I was pretty beat up. When I finally made it out of the checkpoint, the DS made me wade across a fast-flowing, waist-deep stream instead of allowing me to use a small footbridge. It was a parting gesture from him to piss me off. I was now soaking wet and struggling big time. I staggered on for 100 yards to get out of the DS's view and then collapsed in a heap to sort myself out. I just needed to rest for a few minutes. I was beat. The DS had been watching. He shouted and called me back. "Do you want to pull yourself off the course, mate?" he asked. He wasn't being unpleasant. He was just being straight. He knew from looking at me that I was a mess. "No stuff." I staggered to my feet, turned and staggered on. "Then go for it and make up some time," he shouted after me. A big part of me simply longed for someone else to make the decision. I half hoped he would shout again and just pull me off the course, but he didn't. "You fail yourself." Yet something deep inside said, "Keep going." I knew that nothing good in life ever came from quitting, that there would be plenty of time for rest when the hard work was finished, but such thoughts are easier said than done when you are being broken. The next climb up that moongrass, boggy, interminable mountainside I will never forget. I was utterly spent. I stumbled forward a couple of paces, then would collapse to my knees under the weight of the pack. I was feeling very faint, lightheaded, and very, very weak. It's just like when you have a bad fever and try to get up from your bed to walk. Down to my knees I went again. At the summit I felt a little stronger, just a little. I tried desperately to push on and make up some time. Finally I could see the 4-ton trucks below me, parked in a small lay-by next to the dam at the foot of the mountains. I raced down to the dam and clocked in. I knew I was slow as I could see all the other recruits huddled in the woods next to the dam's entrance. Wispy trails of smoke drifted up from the many little self-contained army hexy stoves, each heating individual mugs of sweet tea. I knew the score. Each recruit quietly working in their own little world, trying to rehydrate and sort their kit out under their basher or the camp before the night march. The DS didn't say anything. They simply sent me off to join the others and await orders for the night march. As dusk approached, we all stood on parade. Once more they announced, "Okay, the following will not start the night march. You have not passed today's test." I stood and I waited. 4 names were read out. And then the DS looked up at me, cold, unemotional. And Grills.